June 11, 1962. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, San Francisco Bay, California. 11:30 p.m. The final head count of the night. Guards walk through the cell blocks, checking that every inmate is in their cell, asleep in their bunks. Cell Block B, Cell 138, inmate, present. Cell 140, inmate, present. Cell 142, inmate, present. Everything appears normal. Another quiet night at America's most secure prison. But in 3 cells, 138, 140, and 142, the inmates sleeping peacefully in their bunks aren't inmates at all. They're dummy heads made of soap, toilet paper, and real human hair stolen from the barber shop, painted to look like sleeping men in the darkness. The real inmates? They're gone, vanished into the San Francisco Bay through a ventilation shaft on a raft made of raincoats. They were never seen again. Welcome to Alcatraz, the Rock, the most infamous prison in American history, the place where they sent the criminals who were too dangerous, too violent, too escape-prone for any other facility. From 1934 to 1963, Alcatraz housed the worst of the worst: mobsters, murderers, bank robbers, escape artists, men who had proven they couldn't be contained anywhere else. The government called it escape-proof. They said the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, the treacherous currents, and the mile-and-a-half distance to shore made escape impossible. 36 men tried to escape anyway. Most were caught. Some were shot. 5 disappeared into the bay and were never found, presumed drowned. But 3 men might have made it, and that possibility, that tiny chance that someone actually escaped from the escapable prison, has haunted investigators for over 60 years. But this isn't just a story about escapes. It's a story about the men who were sent to Alcatraz, criminals so dangerous, so infamous, that only America's super maximum security prison could hold them. Over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to introduce you to 5 of the most infamous inmates who ever walked through those gates. Men whose names became synonymous with organized crime, violence, and terror. We're talking about a Chicago gangster whose mind deteriorated so completely in Alcatraz that he spent his final years playing with toy trains, unable to remember his own crimes. A kidnapper and machine gun-wielding bank robber who became Alcatraz's most dangerous inmate, so violent that he was kept in solitary confinement for years and became the only man to successfully sue the prison for cruel and unusual punishment. A mob boss who controlled one of the most powerful crime families in America and turned his time in Alcatraz into a business opportunity, running criminal operations from his cell. An escape artist who broke out of every prison they sent him to, until they sent him to the Rock, where he became the central figure in the greatest prison break mystery of all time. And a brilliant criminal mastermind who transformed from a small-time stick-up artist into one of the most feared gangsters in American history and died in a hail of FBI bullets before he ever made it to Alcatraz. These weren't just criminals, they were legends. Their names appeared in newspapers across the country. Their crimes terrified the nation. Their captures became major news events. And when the government didn't know what else to do with them, when every other prison had failed to contain them, they were sent to Alcatraz. Alcatraz wasn't designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to punish and contain. The rules were simple. You work, you eat, you go back to your cell. No talking during meals, no communication between cells, no privileges, no hope of parole. The average prisoner spent 16 to 23 hours per day locked in a cell that was 5 feet by 9 feet, smaller than most people's bathrooms. The only sounds were footsteps, doors clanging shut, and the constant foghorn from the bay. Some inmates went insane. Some became model prisoners just to earn the right to be transferred somewhere, anywhere else. Some, like the men we're about to meet, became even more notorious inside Alcatraz than they were on the outside. The prison sat on a rock island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. From the cells, inmates could see the city lights, hear the sounds of New Year's Eve celebrations, smell barbecues from the mainland on summer days. They could see freedom, but never touch it. That was part of the psychological torture. You weren't just locked away, you were locked away in sight of the world you could never rejoin. But here's what makes these 5 inmates so fascinating. They didn't break. They didn't give up. They didn't accept their fate. Some planned elaborate escapes. Some ran criminal empires from their cells. Some fought the system till their dying breath. And one became so legendary that the FBI director himself declared war on him. These men were dangerous before Alcatraz. Inside those walls, they became myths. So let me ask you this. What kind of criminal do you have to be for the U.S. government to send you to a prison on a rock island in the middle of the bay, surrounded by freezing water and deadly currents, guarded 24/7 with no chance of parole? You're about to find out. We're starting with number 5, a man whose name you might not know, but whose story perfectly captures what Alcatraz did to the human mind. Then we're working our way up to number 1, the most infamous, most dangerous, most legendary inmate who ever stepped foot in Alcatraz. Let's step through those gates. Let's walk into the cells. Let's meet the 5 most infamous inmates of the Rock. Inmate number 5, Robert Stroud, the Birdman. Number 5, Robert Franklin Stroud, inmate AZ594. The Birdman of Alcatraz. Now, before we go any further, I need to clear up a massive misconception. Robert Stroud is famous as the Birdman of Alcatraz. There was even a 1962 movie starring Burt Lancaster that portrayed him as a gentle, misunderstood soul who studied birds and became a respected ornithologist. That movie was mostly fiction. The real Robert Stroud was a violent, manipulative, dangerous killer who spent most of his adult life in solitary confinement, and he never kept birds in Alcatraz. That all happened in his previous prison, but we'll get to that. Let me tell you who Robert Stroud really was. January 28, 1890, Seattle, Washington. Robert Stroud was born into a troubled family. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when Robert was young. His mother was domineering, controlling, and reportedly had an unhealthy attachment to her son. Robert dropped out of school at age 13 and left home. He drifted around the Pacific Northwest, taking odd jobs, getting into trouble. By his late teens, he was working in Alaska as a pimp, managing prostitutes and taking a cut of their earnings. And that's where his violent nature first emerged. January 18, 1909, Juneau, Alaska. Robert Stroud, age 19, got into an argument with a bartender named F.K./Charlie Von Dahmer. The argument was over a prostitute, one of the women Stroud was pimping, and money she allegedly owed. Stroud pulled out a gun and shot Von Dahmer dead, just like that, over a few dollars and wounded pride. Stroud was arrested, convicted of manslaughter, and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He was sent to McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. Now, a normal person might use prison as a wake-up call, a chance to reflect, reform, change their life. Robert Stroud did the opposite. He became more violent, more dangerous, more unpredictable. In 1912, he was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, a maximum security facility because he was causing too many problems at McNeil Island. And at Leavenworth, Robert Stroud did something that would change his life forever. March 26, 1916, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Stroud was in the prison cafeteria when he encountered a guard named Andrew Turner. There had been ongoing tension between them. Stroud claimed Turner had denied him permission to visit his sick brother. In front of over 1,100 inmates and multiple guards, Robert Stroud pulled out a homemade knife and stabbed Andrew Turner repeatedly. The guard died from his wounds. Stroud was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence, death by hanging. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. Stroud's mother launched a massive letter-writing campaign to save his son's life. She wrote to politicians, newspapers, anyone who would listen. She portrayed Robert as a misunderstood young man who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to die. Incredibly, it worked. Just days before Robert was scheduled to be executed, President Woodrow Wilson commuted his sentence to life in prison. But there was a catch: life in solitary confinement. Robert Stroud would spend the rest of his life locked in a cell, alone, with minimal human contact. And that's when the birds entered the picture. Isolated in his cell at Leavenworth, Stroud found 3 injured sparrows in the prison yard during his brief exercise time. He asked permission to keep them, to nurse them to health. Surprisingly, the prison authorities agreed. Maybe they thought it would keep him calm. Maybe they felt some sympathy for a man facing decades of solitude. Robert Stroud became obsessed with birds. He studied them, bred them, wrote papers on bird diseases. He became a genuine expert on ornithology, the study of birds. He wrote 2 books on the subject that were actually respected by the scientific community. For over 17 years at Leavenworth, Stroud kept birds in his cell. At one point, he had over 300 canaries. His cell became a laboratory. But here's what the movie didn't tell you. Stroud was still violent, still dangerous, still absolutely manipulative. He used his bird research as leverage. He'd threaten to destroy his work if he didn't get privileges. He'd pit guards against each other. He ran a small business selling bird medicine and supplies, making money inside prison. And he never showed remorse for murdering Andrew Turner, never apologized, never acknowledged that he'd done anything wrong. In 1942, prison authorities had enough. They transferred Robert Stroud to Alcatraz. And here's the thing everyone gets wrong. Stroud never kept birds at Alcatraz, not one. The Birdman of Alcatraz never had birds in Alcatraz. At Alcatraz, Stroud was just another inmate in solitary confinement. He was kept in D Block, the segregation unit, away from the general population because he was considered too dangerous. He spent his time writing. He wrote manuscripts on prison reform, on the legal system, on birds. Most of it was never published. He corresponded with people on the outside, scientists, lawyers, journalists. He carefully cultivated an image of himself as a reformed, scholarly man who'd been unjustly punished. Stroud spent 42 years in solitary confinement. Think about that. 42 years alone in a cell, with minimal human contact, no privacy, nothing but his thoughts and his writings. It's one of the longest periods of solitary confinement in American prison history. In 1959, Stroud was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, because his health was failing. November 21, 1963, Robert Stroud died in the prison hospital at age 73. He'd spent 54 years in prison, most of it in solitary confinement. Why he's on this list? Robert Stroud represents what Alcatraz was designed for, containing men who were too dangerous for normal prisons. He'd murdered a federal prison guard in front of over 1,000 witnesses. He was violent, unpredictable, and unrepentant. But he also shows the complexity of the men sent to Alcatraz. He was a killer and a scholar, a violent criminal and a respected ornithologist. The myth of the Birdman of Alcatraz is a Hollywood creation. The reality was far darker. A violent man who spent 40 decades in isolation, who never showed remorse for murder, and died in prison
having never tasted freedom since age 19. But if you think Robert Stroud was dangerous, wait until you meet inmate number 4, a man so violent that even Alcatraz couldn't control him.
Inmate 4, Alvin Creepy Karpis, the last public enemy. Number 4, Alvin Francis Karponowitz, known as Alvin Creepy Karpis, inmate AZ-325, the last man on J. Edgar Hoover's public enemy list. August 10, 1907, Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Alvin was born to Lithuanian immigrant parents who had moved to Canada seeking a better life. When Alvin was young, the family moved to Topeka, Kansas. By age 10, Alvin was stealing. By his teenage years, he was breaking into warehouses and homes. By 20, he was a full-time criminal. But here's what made Alvin different from other petty criminals. He was smart, organized, and absolutely ruthless. In 1931, Alvin Karpis met a man named Fred Barker. Fred was one of the infamous Barker brothers, sons of the legendary Ma Barker, who allegedly ran a criminal gang with her boys. Alvin and Fred formed a partnership that would become one of the most successful criminal operations of the 1930s, the Barker-Karpis Gang. And these guys weren't small time, they were the real deal. The Barker-Karpis Gang specialized in bank robbery and kidnapping. But they didn't just rob banks, they planned meticulously, used the latest weapons, including Thompson submachine guns, and executed their heists with military precision. Between 1931 and 1936, the Barker-Karpis Gang robbed dozens of banks across the Midwest, stole over $3 million, about $60 million in today's money, kidnapped 2 wealthy businessmen for ransom, killed at least 10 people, including police officers and civilians. They were on the FBI's most wanted list. They were front-page news. They were the criminals that J. Edgar Hoover personally wanted to destroy. Now, Alvin earned his nickname Creepy because of his appearance and demeanor. He had a distinctive face. Some said it looked dead, emotionless, like a corpse. His stare unsettled people. He could look at you with absolutely no expression, no emotion, nothing. But don't let the nickname fool you. Alvin Karpis was brilliant. He planned the gang's operations. He studied police tactics. He kept the gang moving, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. One of their most famous crimes, the kidnapping of William Ham, Jr. in 1933. Ham was a wealthy Minnesota brewer. The gang kidnapped him, held him for 4 days, and demanded $100,000 in ransom, about $2 million today. The family paid, and Ham was released unharmed. The gang got away clean. The FBI had no leads. It was the perfect crime. Then they did it again. In 1934, they kidnapped Edward Bremer, a banker from St. Paul, Minnesota. Ransom, $200,000. Again, the family paid. Again, the victim was released. Again, the gang escaped. But their luck was running out. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, was getting more sophisticated. They were using new investigative techniques, fingerprint analysis, forensic evidence, coordinated multi-state operations. In January 1935, the FBI caught up with Fred Barker and his mother, Ma Barker, at a house in Florida. A massive shootout ensued. Both Fred and Ma were killed in a hail of bullets. Alvin Karpis was now on his own, and he was the FBI's #1 target. J. Edgar Hoover made Alvin Karpis a personal crusade. Hoover had been criticized for never personally arresting a major criminal. He was a bureaucrat, not a field agent. Critics said he was all talk, no action. Hoover decided he would personally arrest Alvin Karpis. May 1, 1936, New Orleans, Louisiana.
FBI agents had tracked Karpis to an apartment building. They surrounded the location, and J. Edgar Hoover himself flew to New Orleans to be there for the arrest. When agents burst into Karpis's apartment, he was caught completely off guard. No shootout, no dramatic escape. He was arrested without resistance. And Hoover, in a carefully staged photo opportunity, stood next to the captured Karpis and claimed credit for the arrest, even though field agents had done all the actual work. Alvin Karpis was convicted on multiple charges: kidnapping, robbery, murder. Sentence: life imprisonment. And the government sent him to the one place designed to hold men like him, Alcatraz. Karpis arrived at Alcatraz in August 1936. He was 29 years old. He would spend the next 26 years there, the longest sentence of any Alcatraz inmate. At Alcatraz, Karpis became a model prisoner. He didn't cause trouble. He followed the rules. He worked in the bakery, in the furniture shop, wherever they assigned him. But he was also smart enough to survive in a brutal environment. Alcatraz wasn't just physically harsh, it was psychologically devastating. Many inmates went insane, others became violent, some committed suicide. Karpis kept his head down and did his time. He befriended other inmates, including the young Charles Manson, who arrived at Alcatraz in the late 1950s. Karpis allegedly taught Manson how to play guitar, a detail that's both fascinating and horrifying given what Manson would later become. In 1962, Alcatraz closed. Karpis was transferred to McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. In 1969, after 33 years in federal prison, Alvin Karpis was paroled. He was 62 years old. He'd gone into prison during the Great Depression and come out during the Vietnam War. The world had completely changed. Karpis moved to Canada, then to Spain. He lived quietly, occasionally giving interviews about his criminal past. August 26, 1979, Torremolinos, Spain. Alvin Karpis died of a drug overdose. Whether it was accidental or suicide, no one knows for certain. He was 72 years old. Why he's on this list. Alvin Karpis was the last of the Public Enemy-era criminals, the bank robbers and gangsters who terrorized America during the 1930s. He was so dangerous that J. Edgar Hoover personally made him a target. He spent 26 years in Alcatraz, longer than any other inmate. He survived the brutal conditions, the isolation, the psychological torture. And unlike many criminals who died in shootouts or were executed, Karpis lived long enough to see freedom again. He outlasted the FBI agents who caught him, outlasted J. Edgar Hoover himself, and died on his own terms. He represents the evolution of American organized crime, from the wild, violent gangster era of the 1930s to the more sophisticated criminal operations that came later. But Karpis, for all his criminal brilliance, was still just a bank robber. Our next inmate was something far more dangerous, a mob boss who ran a criminal empire from inside Alcatraz.
Inmate 3, Whitey Bulger, the Boston mobster. Number 3, James Joseph Whitey Bulger, Jr., Inmate AZ-1428. The Boston mob boss who became an FBI informant, a fugitive for 16 years, and one of the most brutal killers in American organized crime history. Wait, you might be asking, Whitey Bulger was in Alcatraz? The guy who was captured in 2011? The guy from the movie Black Mass with Johnny Depp? Yes. Before Whitey became the boss of Boston's Winter Hill Gang, before he became an FBI informant, before he became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, he was an inmate at Alcatraz. And what happened to him there may have shaped everything that came after. September 3, 1929, Dorchester, Boston, Massachusetts. James Bulger, Jr. was born into a poor Irish-American family in South Boston. His father was a longshoreman who lost his arm in an accident and struggled to support 6 children. The family lived in public housing projects in one of Boston's toughest neighborhoods. Young James, who earned the nickname Whitey because of his platinum blonde hair, grew up surrounded by poverty, violence, and crime. By his teenage years, Whitey was running with street gangs, theft, assault, extortion, the usual progression for kids in that environment. In 1956, at age 27, Whitey Bulger and his associates robbed several banks across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They were eventually caught. Whitey was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He was initially sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but Whitey was a problem inmate. He got into fights, he violated rules, he was defiant toward guards. So in 1959, the government transferred him to Alcatraz. Whitey Bulger arrived at Alcatraz at age 30, and this is where his story gets dark in a different way. At Alcatraz, Whitey became part of a secret CIA program called MK Ultra. Now this sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense, but is actually documented fact. The CIA in the 1950s and 60s was conducting experiments on unwitting subjects, including prison inmates, testing the effects of LSD and other drugs for potential use in interrogations and mind control. Alcatraz was one of the locations where these experiments took place. Whitey Bulger voluntarily participated in these experiments. Why? Because participants got reduced sentences, better prison conditions, and other privileges. For over a year, Whitey was given massive doses of LSD. He later described the experience as horrific, hallucinations, psychological terror, feeling like his mind was being torn apart. Years later, Whitey would say that the MK Ultra experiments changed him, made him more paranoid, more violent, more ruthless. Whether that's true or just an excuse for his later crimes, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the Whitey Bulger that left Alcatraz in 1965 was different from the man who entered. When Whitey was released from prison in 1965, he returned to South Boston, and he immediately got involved in organized crime. He worked his way up through the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American organized crime group that controlled much of Boston's criminal activity. By the mid-1970s, Whitey Bulger was the boss, and this is where he became truly dangerous. Whitey ran Boston's underworld with an iron fist. Drug trafficking, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, murder. The Winter Hill Gang was involved in everything. But Whitey had an advantage that other mob bosses didn't have. He was an FBI informant. Starting in 1975, Whitey became a top-echelon informant for the FBI. He provided information about the Italian mafia, La Cosa Nostra, which was the FBI's primary target at the time. In exchange, the FBI protected Whitey. They ignored his crimes. They tipped him off to investigations. They allowed him to eliminate his rivals while claiming they were gathering intelligence. For over 20 years, Whitey Bulger ran Boston's criminal underworld while being protected by the FBI. He's believed to have been personally involved in at least 19 murders. Some estimates put it higher, maybe 40 or 50. He tortured people. He buried bodies. He killed anyone who threatened him, including former friends and associates. In 1994, Whitey's FBI handler tipped him off that he was about to be indicted. Whitey fled. For the next 16 years, Whitey Bulger was a fugitive. He was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, second only to Osama bin Laden. The FBI offered a $2 million reward for information leading to his capture. And he disappeared completely. June 22, 2011, Santa Monica, California. After a renewed publicity campaign, the FBI received a tip that Whitey Bulger was living in a rent-controlled apartment with his longtime girlfriend. FBI agents raided the apartment and found Whitey, now 81 years old, white-haired, disguised as a retiree, along with over $800,000 in cash and a massive arsenal of weapons. He was arrested without resistance. 2013. Whitey Bulger went to trial for 19 murders, plus racketeering, extortion, and other charges. He was convicted on 11 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years. But Whitey never showed remorse, never admitted guilt. He claimed he'd been framed, that the FBI had made him a scapegoat. October 30th, 2018. United States Penitentiary, Hazleton, West Virginia. Whitey Bulger, now 89 years old and in a wheelchair, was transferred to a new prison. Within hours of arriving, he was brutally murdered by other inmates. They beat him to death with a lock in a sock. They tried to gouge out his eyes, allegedly as a message about being an informant, a rat. Whitey Bulger died the way he lived, through violence. Why he's on this list? Whitey Bulger's time at Alcatraz was relatively brief, about 6 years, but it was formative. The MK-Ultra experiments, the brutal conditions, the survival instincts he developed there, all of it shaped who he became. He represents the modern evolution of organized crime, the mobster who works with law enforcement while committing horrific crimes, the one who uses the system while destroying lives. And he's a reminder that Alcatraz didn't just contain dangerous men, they created them. The prison's brutal conditions, the psychological experiments, the isolation, these things didn't reform criminals, they made them worse. Whitey went into Alcatraz as a bank robber. He came out as something far more dangerous. But if Whitey was dangerous because of his brutality and corruption, our next inmate was dangerous because he was brilliant, organized, and absolutely ruthless in building a criminal empire.
Inmate 2. Al Capone, the fallen kingpin. Number 2. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, inmate AZ-85, Scarface, Big Al, the most famous gangster in American history, and the man who Alcatraz destroyed. January 17th, 1899, Brooklyn, New York. Al Capone was born to Italian immigrant parents in a crowded Brooklyn tenement. His father was a barber who struggled to support 9 children. Al dropped out of school at age 14 after hitting a teacher. He started running with street gangs, working for local mobsters, learning the trade. In his late teens, Al was working as a bartender in a Brooklyn dive bar when he insulted a woman. Her brother, a small-time gangster, slashed Al's face with a knife, giving him the scars that would earn him the nickname Scarface. In 1919, Al Capone moved to Chicago to work for Johnny Torrio, a major bootlegger and organized crime boss. And when Prohibition went into effect in 1920, Al's career took off. He was smart, charismatic, ruthless, and absolutely willing to use violence to get what he wanted. By the mid-1920s, after Torrio retired, Al Capone was the boss of the Chicago outfit, and he transformed it into a criminal empire. At his peak, Al Capone's organization was generating $100 million per year, about $1.5 billion in today's money. They controlled bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and various legitimate businesses across Chicago. Al lived like a king. Expensive suits, luxury cars, a mansion in Florida. He was a celebrity. Newspapers wrote about him. Photographers followed him. People asked for his autograph. But Al had 2 major problems. First, he was flashy. He loved attention. He loved being famous, and that made him a target. Second, he was sloppy with money. He spent lavishly but never paid taxes on his illegal income. The federal government, led by prosecutor Elliot Ness and Treasury agent Frank Wilson, built a case against Al Capone. Not for murder. They couldn't prove he'd personally killed anyone. Not for bootlegging. Too hard to trace back to him directly. They got him on tax evasion. October 17th, 1931.
Al Capone was convicted of failing to pay federal income tax on his illegal earnings. Sentence: 11 years in federal prison. He was initially sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but even in prison, Al was still running the Chicago outfit. He had special privileges, access to phone calls, visits from associates, better food and accommodations. The government decided Al needed to be sent somewhere where he couldn't run his organization. In August 1934, Al Capone was transferred to Alcatraz. Al Capone arrived at Alcatraz at age 35. He was inmate AZ-85, one of the first inmates sent to the newly opened super maximum security facility. And Alcatraz broke him. See, Al had contracted syphilis years earlier, probably in his 20s from his time around prostitution operations. He never got it properly treated. Syphilis, left untreated, eventually attacks the brain. It causes dementia, paranoia, hallucinations, and complete mental deterioration. At Alcatraz, Al's condition worsened dramatically. The stress, the isolation, the inability to get proper medical treatment, all of it accelerated his decline. Guards reported that Al would spend hours staring at walls, talking to himself. He'd forget where he was. He'd have conversations with people who weren't there. Other inmates who had feared Al Capone on the outside now pitied him. Here was the most powerful gangster in America, reduced to a confused, deteriorating shell of himself. Al spent 4.5 years at Alcatraz, from 1934 to 1939. By the time he was transferred to Terminal Island Federal Penitentiary in California, his mind was gone. In November 1939, Al Capone was released from prison. His sentence had been reduced due to his deteriorating health and good behavior. But the Al Capone who walked out of prison wasn't the same man who went in. He had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. He couldn't manage his own affairs. He couldn't remember major events from his criminal career. He retired to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. He spent his final years playing with toy trains, fishing, wandering around his property in a bathrobe, often not recognizing family members. January 25, 1947. Al Capone died of cardiac arrest following a stroke. He was only 48 years old. The most powerful gangster in American history died confused, broken, and forgotten. Why he's number 2 on this list. Al Capone is the most famous inmate Alcatraz ever held. His presence gave the prison legitimacy. If Alcatraz could hold Al Capone, it could hold anyone. But more than that, Al Capone's story shows what Alcatraz was designed to do: break men. Not just physically contain them, but psychologically destroy them. The prison didn't rehabilitate Al. It didn't make him better. It watched as disease ravaged his mind, and it did nothing. He went in as the king of Chicago and came out as a broken, childlike figure who couldn't remember his own crimes. Alcatraz didn't just imprison Al, it erased him. But there's one inmate who Alcatraz couldn't break, one man whose legend only grew inside those walls. One escape became the greatest prison mystery in American history. Let me introduce you to inmate number 1.
Frank Morris and the Anglin Brothers, The Great Escape. Number 1. Frank Lee Morris, inmate AZ-1441, and John and Clarence Anglin, inmates AZ-1476 and AZ-1485. The men who may have done the impossible: escape from Alcatraz. Let me start with Frank Morris because he was the mastermind. September 1, 1926, Washington, D.C.
Frank Morris was born to unknown parents and immediately placed in foster care. He never knew his biological family. He bounced between foster homes throughout his childhood, 13 different homes by age 11. And from an early age, Frank was a criminal, but not a violent one. Frank was a thief, a burglar, an escape artist. By age 13, he'd been convicted of his first crime. By his 20s, he'd escaped from multiple institutions, juvenile detention centers, county jails, even a Louisiana state prison. Frank Morris had an IQ of 133, in the genius range. He was methodical, patient, brilliant at planning, and his specialty was escaping from prisons. The authorities kept catching him, and he kept escaping. It became a pattern. Finally, after one too many escapes, the federal government decided Frank needed to be sent somewhere escape-proof. In January 1960, Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz. He was 34 years old. The authorities thought they'd finally contained him. They were wrong. Around the same time, two brothers arrived at Alcatraz, John and Clarence Anglin. The Anglin brothers were from a poor family in rural Georgia. They started as small-time criminals, robbing banks mostly. They weren't violent, they weren't particularly sophisticated, but they were persistent. And like Frank Morris, they had a talent for escaping. They'd escaped from multiple prisons before being sent to Alcatraz. When Frank Morris met the Anglin brothers in Alcatraz, he recognized kindred spirits, men who refused to accept their imprisonment, men who were willing to take enormous risks for a chance at freedom. And together, they hatched a plan. Here's what they did, and remember, this is all documented, confirmed by investigators. The cell modifications. Over the course of 6 months, using stolen spoons and a drill made from a vacuum cleaner motor, Frank and the Anglins slowly widened the ventilation grates in their cells. The grates were old, the concrete around them was deteriorating, and they could be chipped away bit by bit. They did this work at night during music hour, when an accordion player would play loudly, covering the sound of their digging. They hid their progress by creating fake grates out of cardboard and paint, perfectly colored to match the real ones. The dummy heads. They created realistic-looking heads out of soap, toilet paper, and real human hair stolen from the prison barber shop. They painted them with flesh tones, added eyebrows and features. From a distance, in the darkness, they looked like sleeping inmates. The raft and life preservers. They stole over 50 raincoats from other inmates and the prison laundry. They used contact cement, stolen from a maintenance detail work assignment, to fuse the raincoats into a makeshift raft and life preservers. They built all of this in a utility corridor behind their cells, a space that was supposed to be inaccessible, but which they'd secretly entered through the widened vents. June 11, 1962, the night of the escape. After lights out, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin placed their dummy heads in their bunks, made it look like they were sleeping, and crawled through the ventilation shafts into the utility corridor. They climbed up to the roof through a ventilation system, crossed over the roof, climbed down a drain pipe to the ground, and made their way to the shoreline. A fourth inmate, Alan West, was supposed to go with them, but he couldn't widen his vent in time and was left behind. Frank and the Anglins launched their raft into the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay and paddled into the darkness. They were never seen again. The next morning, guards discovered the escape. The FBI launched a massive investigation. The Coast Guard searched the bay. Every law enforcement agency in California was on alert. They found pieces of the raft washed up on Angel Island. They found a paddle. They found personal items belonging to the escapees. But they never found bodies, and they never found the men. The official position of the FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service is that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in San Francisco Bay. The water was 50 degrees, cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. The currents were treacherous. The distance to shore was over a mile. Survival seemed impossible. But here's the thing. No bodies were ever found. Not in the bay, not washed up on shore, nowhere. And over the years, evidence has emerged suggesting they might have survived. In 2013, the San Francisco police received a letter allegedly from John Anglin, claiming all 3 men survived and were living in Brazil. The letter was never authenticated, but handwriting experts said it was possibly genuine. In 2015, the History Channel aired a documentary showing a photograph allegedly taken in Brazil in 1975, showing 2 men who looked remarkably like the Anglin brothers, older but recognizable. In 2016, a team of engineers used modern modeling techniques to analyze the tides and currents on the night of the escape. Their conclusion: survival was possible if they'd entered the water at exactly the right time and made it to Angel Island. Family members of the Anglins have claimed for years that they received Christmas cards from the brothers for years after the escape, cards with no return address, postmarked from different locations. So, did they make it? Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers actually escape from Alcatraz? The truth is, nobody knows for certain. The U.S. Marshal Service keeps the case open. As of 2024, Frank Morris would be 98 years old, John Anglin would be 95, Clarence Anglin would be 94. If they're alive, they're old men now, and they've kept their secret for over 60 years. Why they're number 1 on this list? Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers represent the ultimate challenge to Alcatraz's reputation as escape-proof. They planned for months, executed their plan perfectly, and disappeared into the night. Whether they died in the bay or lived the rest of their lives in freedom, they accomplished something no one else did. They got out of Alcatraz. They turned the prison's greatest strength, its isolation, its location, its reputation, against itself. They exposed weaknesses in a system that claimed to be perfect. And they created the greatest prison escape mystery in American history, a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Alcatraz closed less than a year after their escape, in March 1963. Some say the government shut it down because maintaining it was too expensive. Others say it was because the escape had humiliated the prison system and proven that even Alcatraz wasn't truly inescapable. Frank Morris was a genius with a 133 IQ who spent his life escaping from prisons. The Anglin brothers were persistent criminals who refused to accept captivity. Together, they beat Alcatraz. And whether they lived or died, they...
So there you have it, the 5 most infamous inmates of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Robert Stroud, the violent killer who became an ornithologist and spent 42 years in solitary confinement. Alvin Creepy Karpis, the last public enemy, who spent 26 years in Alcatraz, longer than any other inmate. Whitey Bulger, the Boston mob boss who survived MK Ultra and became one of the most brutal criminals in American history. Al Capone, the king of Chicago, whose mind deteriorated inside Alcatraz, dying at age 48 as a broken shell of his former self. And Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, the escape artists who may have done the impossible and beaten the Rock. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary operated for 29 years, from 1934 to 1963. In that time, it housed 1,576 inmates. It was the end of the line, the place where the most dangerous, most escape-prone, most uncontrollable criminals were sent. The prison sat on a rock island in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing water and deadly currents. It was designed to be escape-proof, punishment-oriented, psychologically devastating.
And it succeeded. Most inmates who spent time in Alcatraz came out broken, mentally, physically, emotionally. Some never came out at all. But what does Alcatraz really represent? It represents America's approach to punishment in the mid-20th century, the belief that dangerous criminals needed to be removed from society, isolated completely, given no hope of redemption or rehabilitation. It represents the failure of that approach, because Alcatraz didn't make criminals better, it made them worse, or it broke them completely. It represents the limits of even the most secure prison, because despite all the security, despite all the precautions, at least 3 men may have escaped. Today, Alcatraz is a tourist attraction. Over 1 million people visit every year. They walk through the cell blocks, stand in the tiny cells, hear the stories of the men who were imprisoned there. It's been closed for over 60 years, but the legend lives on. The legend of Al Capone going insane in his cell. The legend of Robert Stroud and his birds, even though he never kept birds there. The legend of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, and whether they actually made it to freedom. These stories have become part of American mythology. They've been turned into movies, TV shows, documentaries. They've been exaggerated, romanticized, fictionalized. But the reality is darker and more complex than the legends. These weren't Robin Hood figures or sympathetic anti-heroes. They were criminals who hurt people, who killed, who destroyed lives. They deserved to be in prison. But they were also human beings, and what Alcatraz did to them, the isolation, the psychological torture, the complete removal of hope, that raises difficult questions about what punishment should be and how far is too far. So let me leave you with some final questions. Did Alcatraz serve its purpose? It contained dangerous criminals, yes, but did it make society safer? Or did it just warehouse men until they died or went insane? Should prisons be about punishment or rehabilitation? Alcatraz chose punishment. Is that the right choice, or should we try to reform criminals and give them a chance at redemption? And the biggest question, did Frank Morris and the Anglins survive? Are they out there somewhere, old men who pulled off the impossible, or did they drown in the bay, their bodies never recovered, their escape attempt ending in death? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Which of these 5 inmates surprised you the most? Do you think Frank Morris and the Anglins survived? Should Alcatraz be reopened for the worst criminals? What other infamous Alcatraz inmates should we cover? If you learned something new today, if this changed how you think about America's most infamous prison, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Smash that like button if you made it all the way through this deep dive. Share this with anyone who's fascinated by true crime, prison history, or the dark side of American justice. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed on March 21, 1963. The last inmates were transferred to other facilities. The island was left empty, the cells abandoned, the whole place becoming a ghost of what it once was. In 1972, Alcatraz became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Now it's a museum, a historic site, a reminder of a different era in American criminal justice. But the stories remain, the legends persist, and the mystery of what really happened to Frank Morris and the Anglins continues to haunt investigators to this day. The Rock, the most infamous prison in American history, home to the most dangerous criminals the nation had ever seen. Some died there, some went insane, some served their time and were released, broken shells of their former selves. And 3 men, maybe, possibly, incredibly, escaped into the night and were never seen again. That's the legend of Alcatraz. That's the story that will never die. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember, even in the most secure prison ever built, even on a rock island surrounded by freezing water, the human desire for freedom can't be completely contained. This has been the story of the 5 most infamous inmates of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary.